I'm Sean Donahue. I'm currently a doctoral candidate in philosophy at the University of Southern California. And in this video, I'll be sharing some of my thoughts about collective procedural memory. To get an intuitive sense of what collective procedural memory is, I want you to start by exercising your imagination. First, imagine a disaster striking your community. Maybe this is an unusually large flood. Perhaps it's even a global pandemic. Your politician appears in the media promising to ensure that a similar disaster never happens again. Second, imagine a population gaining some ability, possessing it for some time, and then losing it. Maybe this is the United States' ability to produce Saturn V rockets. Saturn V's were used in NASA's Apollo and Skylab space missions from 1967 to 73, but could not be made since at least the 1990s. And third, imagine a project that takes multiple generations to complete. Maybe this is the construction of the Sagrada Familia Cathedral in Barcelona, Spain. Designed by Antoni Gaudí, who died in 1926, construction of the cathedral started in 1882 and is projected to be completed in 2026. Now, what do these examples all have in common? Well, all of them are about many people together acting in some way. All of them are primarily about people doing something together as opposed to merely thinking or believing something together. And all of them presuppose some kind of memory. If your local politician really means never, then fulfilling his promise is going to require ensuring that your neighborhood's future inhabitants remember how to react appropriately to the next similar disaster. It is natural to say that the people of the United States, circa 1970, had some memory of how to produce Saturn V rockets that they lost by the 1990s. And it's also natural to say that the people building the Sagrada Familia, circa 2020, still remembered how to carry out Gaudí's plans over 100 years later. In other words, all these examples involve collective procedural memory, the ability of many people, in some sense, to remember how to do something together over time. Understanding collective procedural memory is both morally and practically important. Future generations will fail to be resilient to repeating hazardous events unless they remember how to prepare for them. And projects like counteracting climate change and preserving information require the cooperation of many people over multiple generations. Despite this importance, very little has been said about collective procedural memory. My aim in this talk is to help overcome this deficit by presenting my own definition of collective procedural memory that I call the ability conception. I'll be defining the ability conception and summarizing how it works. I'll then compare the ability conception to competing definitions of collective procedural memory and argue these various advantages. And finally, I'll be showing that the ability conception has important practical consequences, such as helping us understand a challenge groups have in preserving collective procedural memory that manifests itself in the dynamic that I call the saeculum effect. Before defining the ability conception, it's going to be helpful if we have in mind an example of collective procedural memory. In 1907, a major tsunami hit Simeulue Island in Indonesia, tragically killing over half the Simeulue natives. In response, the survivors introduced what they called the Smong story into their oral tradition, which gave instructions to listeners about how to survive a similar event. When a major tsunami hit in 2004, barely any of the survivors of the 1907 event were still alive. But their descendants who had heard the Smong story heeded its advice and encouraged the villagers to move the high land. As a result, almost none of the Simeulue Islanders died. In 2004, the population of Simeulue Islanders clearly had a collective procedural memory of how to be resilient to tsunamis. But what should we take this to mean? I propose that the following ability conception of collective procedural memory captures the essential features of this paradigm case. According to this definition, a population O has a collective procedural memory of how to X at a time T if and only if the individuals in O engage in a set of practices P such that each of these four conditions is met. First is the potentiality condition. At T, O has the ability to X in virtue of the individuals in O engaging in the practices in P. Next is the endurance condition. At some time T prime, earlier than T, O had the ability to X in virtue of the individuals in O engaging in the practices in P. Third is the reliability condition. Over some contextually defined range of environments in which O engages in the practices in P, and that are similar to the actual environment that O is situated in at T, O has the ability to X in virtue of the individuals in O engaging in the practices in P. Fourth and finally is the causality condition. At T, the practices in P have been caused by a triggering event prior to T, either by selection effects on the practices in P or by their modification in response to the triggering event by members in O. By practice, I mean either any pattern of collective behavior that is itself a collective procedural memory or any pattern of behavior exhibited by an individual. Practices are patterns of intentional or non-intentional behavior, such as telling stories, constructing barometers, taking barometer readings, reading tea leaves, and so forth. The basic idea of the ability conception is to provide a recursive characterization of collective procedural memory that ultimately explains collective outcomes in terms of individual practice. For example, collective procedural memory of how to construct the Sagrada Familia presupposes some kind of collective procedural memory of how to construct lifting cranes, which in turn presupposes the individual practice of welding, and so forth. Explaining collective procedural memory does not always require an explanation in terms of individual practice. Likewise, explaining computer behavior doesn't always require an explanation in terms of activating logic gates. But the working assumption of my model is that such an explanation is in principle always possible. Okay, so that's the ability conception in the abstract. To better understand how it works, let's consider each of these conditions in more detail and whether they apply to our case of the Simeulue Islanders. When the tsunami hit in 2004, the islanders were clearly resilient to this event. Because what is saved as a memory can be either actual or merely potential, the islanders still had what it takes to display this resilience, even if the tsunami didn't occur at that particular time. We capture the sense of the potentiality of memory for free with the notion of an ability, since abilities can be both actual or potential. Next, the islanders didn't have foreknowledge of when the tsunami would occur. Nevertheless, because they had a collective procedural memory, they would have displayed comparable resilience to the tsunami had it occurred earlier. The endurance condition captures this fact because the Simeulue Islanders had the ability to be resilient to tsunamis even before the tsunami in fact hit in 2004. Let's move on to the reliability condition. This condition is meant to capture our sense that if a group has a collective procedural memory, then there is some kind of outcome, such as a collective behavior, object, and so forth, that it can reliably produce. To see this, consider a contrasting case in which this condition fails. Imagine that a herd of cows used to graze on the tender seaside grass that grew next to a village of Simeulue Islanders. When the tsunami hit, this herd of cows also retreated to the high ground in the mountains where they found grass to eat. Because this grass happened to be even better than the seaside grass that the cows normally ate, this grazing herd stayed on the mountain and in this way avoided the next tsunami when it hit many years later. Now, what should we make about this case? I claim that although we might be disposed to describe an ability to avoid tsunamis to this grazing herd in virtue of the individuals that compose it having the practice of eating grass, it seems strange to ascribe to the herd a collective procedural memory of tsunami resiliency. Nevertheless, the two conditions of the ability conception that we've covered so far can't explain why we have this judgment. Although we have yet to discuss the causality condition, appealing to it also seems unpromising because the tsunami has caused the modification of the herd's practice of eating grass. I think that what explains our hesitancy to ascribe collective procedural memory here is a failure of the reliability condition. We can imagine many situations similar to the actual one in which the herd practices grass eating, but nevertheless does not have any significant ability to avoid tsunamis. For instance, if the grass on the mountain were not as good as plentiful, or if a plant that was even better to eat grew somewhere else along the seashore, the grazing herd would have quickly returned to the ocean side and met a disastrous fate. The Simeulue Islanders are in a different situation. Of course, in some situations, they might not have been able to avoid the tsunami, such as if the mountains surrounding the village were all occupied by violent militias, but in the contextually relevant range of similar environments, they would have escaped the tsunami in virtue of their practice of oral storytelling just as well. The reliability condition captures this fact. Now, lastly, we have the causality condition. We're going to need some condition like this because practices must be shaped by a triggering event in order to support a collective procedural memory. A group of people who never encountered a tsunami because they lived far inland would have some ability to avoid tsunamis in virtue of the practice of inland dwelling, but this wouldn't be a collective procedural memory. By contrast, the similar islanders we're considering have practices, namely an oral tradition, that was in fact shaped by past encounters with tsunamis. They fulfill the causality condition for this reason. But the causality condition also captures practices supporting collective procedural memory that are shaped non-deliberatively. This enables the ability conception to be neutral in its application across an adequate range of cases. For example, in his paper Adaptation Without Insight, Kim sternly recounts how Fijian islanders can build huts that resist cyclones, even though they cannot explain how the particular designs they use give them this property. Such hut builders may succeed through what he calls blind trusting imitation of their forerunners. Going further, one could even perhaps imagine cases in which some practices simply persist because unsuccessful builders simply did not survive. Even if further anthropological evidence does not support such a hypothesis, a definition of collective procedural memory shouldn't prejudge the issue. For this reason, the causality condition covers the role that selection effects on practices may play as well. So that's the ability conception of collective procedural memory. Now, as I mentioned earlier, very little has been written about collective procedural memory. But this doesn't mean that the ability conception is the only definition of collective procedural memory on the market. Yet I think that a little examination shows that the ability conception is better than these alternatives. If you research collective procedural memory, the alternative definition you'll most frequently encounter is that collective procedural memory is a kind of collective know-how. The main problem with this definition is that it's too controversial to help us better understand collective procedural memory. Theorists of know-how are roughly split into two camps, the intellectualists and the anti-intellectualists. Intellectualists hold that all instances of know-how are in some sense reducible to a form of propositional knowledge. For instance, if a person knows how to balance on a bike, then she succeeds at this task in virtue of having a belief directed to a proposition about a way of bike balancing. Anti-intellectualists deny that all instances of know-how are reducible to propositional knowledge in this way. Define collective procedural memory as collective know-how requires taking a stand on this protracted debate. Furthermore, intellectualists about collective know-how would be committed to the controversial notion that collectives can have mental states directed towards propositional content. Collectives might have mental states, but it would be preferable if a definition of collective procedural memory did not prejudge the issue one way or another. The ability conception achieves this goal because it's much less controversial that collectives have abilities than that they possess know-how, let alone some kind of mental state. Next, some authors have defined collective procedural memory as essentially related to a population's sense of identity. Collective procedural memory undeniably bears some connection to collective identity in at least some cases. Remembering how to build Saturn V rockets that made the moon landing possible contributed to some people's sense of identity as United States citizens, for instance. The problem with this definition, however, is that collective procedural memory does not necessarily play this role. Suppose that big company must combine widgets and gadgets in order to make its flagship computer, and furthermore has been doing this for several years. Clearly, some population has a collective procedural memory of how to produce the flagship computer, and whatever population has this memory must contain at least the populations of big company, widget makers, and gadget makers. Suppose also that widgets and gadgets are modular products. That is, widget makers and gadget makers sell them to buyers like big company without knowing how exactly they're going to be used. Many of the widget makers and gadget makers are consequently essential to a population that has a collective procedural memory of how to produce the flagship computer, even though they do not think of themselves as having this identity. Now, the ability conception, by contrast, applies to expressions of collective procedural memory like that involved in the production of the flagship computer. And it also applies to expressions of collective procedural memory that bear a substantial relation to group identity, such as the production of the Saturn V rocket. The ability conception is consequently better than definitions according to which collective procedural memory essentially involves group identity. So now up to this point, I focused on the theoretical benefits of the ability conception. I'd like to finish by emphasizing a couple of its practical benefits as well. First, the ability conception appropriately emphasizes action. A group cannot appropriately consider itself as having a collective procedural memory of how to do something unless it actually has the ability to do this thing. This helps overcome the bias that we often see towards seeing other kinds of collective memory as sufficient for collective procedural memory. I believe that we sometimes see this bias expressed in our memorialization efforts. Now, there are multiple legitimate reasons why we memorialize, and I believe that memorialization is morally important. But one reason that people often reflexively offer for memorializing is that remembering past events helps us avoid their future repetition. This response presupposes that some kind of collective semantic memory, such as a collective knowledge that these past events happened, naturally leads to a collective procedural memory of how to respond to these events in the future. The example of the Simulu Islanders shows that collective semantic and procedural memories can indeed be closely related in this way. But I think that this isn't something that we should presuppose. Having a robust collective semantic memory of the past may even lure us into a false sense of security about how well we can react in the future. The ability conception helps us avoid this mistake. Second, the ability conception helps us better describe and investigate emerging evidence about collective memory dynamics, in particular, a phenomenon that I call the saeculum effect. A saeculum is the length of an average human lifespan in a population. The saeculum effect is the tendency of populations to display a decline in resiliency to hazardous events that recur with a periodicity of a saeculum or greater. There is convergent evidence that the saeculum effect exists. For example, geological investigations by Fanta and others show that some populations exposed to floods of a magnitude that happen roughly every 100 to 200 years respond by settling in higher elevations, only to return to the floodplain after a couple generations and be subjected to the next event. Historical surveys of medieval and Renaissance Europe by Turchin and Nefedov support the existence of cycles of social violence that repeat every 40 to 60 years. The basic explanation for these cycles is that populations with continued incentive to conflict oscillate between periods of violence and relative peace as generations with direct experience of civil strife die off. And disaster planning experts comment that the tendency of populations to forget events after about 3 generations contributed to the destructiveness of the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami in March 2011. Assuming that the saeculum effect exists, how should we think of the problem of avoiding it? Well, to me, this is clearly a problem of preserving collective procedural memory over multiple generations, and the ability conception gives us guidance in interpreting what this means. Defining something is, of course, different from understanding how it is produced, but definitions nevertheless help us gain this understanding by providing conceptual clarity and by enabling us to formulate better questions. In this case, these are questions about which social practices and which kinds of collective memory may contribute to the preservation of collective procedural memory. Overall, in spite of being an underexplored area of research, collective procedural memory is a ubiquitous feature of our social life. And I believe that the ability conception is the best definition to shed more light in this area. As we continue to develop new ways to store and interpret information about our past, the topic of collective procedural memory strikes me as one that's ripe for future development. Okay, thank you for watching.